No one could touch this raged bull. For 2 years, he was a force of pure, untamable fury, a black hole of anger that had shattered fences, splintered gates, and broken the spirits of the most seasoned cowboys. They called him Diablo, and the name fit. He was a devil on 4 legs, a creature whose heart seemed to beat only with violence. No one could get near him. No one could calm him. And now, the final decision had been made. He was too dangerous to keep. But then, a 6-year-old boy named Eli, a child whose own world was confined to the quiet hum of a wheelchair, made an impossible request. He asked to see him. As his father wheeled him toward the reinforced steel pen, a hush fell over the hardened men who had gathered to watch. They expected a tragedy. They braced for the worst. Diablo snorted, a plume of dust exploding from his nostrils. He pawed at the dry earth, his massive head low, horns aimed like daggers, and then he stopped. Slowly, with a caution that defied his entire existence, the beast approached the fence. He lowered his head, and in a gesture that shattered every law of nature they had ever known, he gently, tenderly, nuzzled the boy's small, outstretched hand. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down the faces of men who hadn't cried in decades. What happened in that moment was more than a miracle. It was a memory unlocked by a sound no one else could have made. If you find stories like this moving, make sure to subscribe so you never miss one. And let us know your city or country below. It's truly inspiring to connect with viewers from all over the world. Now, let's begin the story of a love that even time couldn't erase. The legend of Diablo wasn't written in books. It was etched in scars and broken lumber. It lived in the nervous tremor of a ranch hand's voice and the wide berth everyone gave the far pasture. Before he was Diablo, he was just a number on a tag, a promising young bull from a champion bloodline. But something in him had curdled. Something had taken the raw power of his breed and twisted it into relentless, explosive rage. The first incident was a splintered top rail on a new fence, dismissed as a fluke. The second was a charging feint that sent a veteran cowboy scrambling over a gate, his face pale with a fear he'd never admit to. By the third, when he gored a water trough and sent it spinning through the air like a discarded toy, the legend was born. He wasn't just aggressive, he was intelligent in his destruction. He learned the weak points in the fences. He seemed to recognize the sight of a tranquilizer rifle and would retreat to the far side of his enclosure, watching with an unnerving stillness until the threat was gone. David, Eli's father, knew the stories better than anyone. He was the ranch manager, a man who had inherited the land and its burdens from his own father. But the heaviest burden wasn't the failing finances or the constant repairs. It was the hollow space in his home where his wife's laughter used to be. Sarah had been the soul of this place. Now there was just the dust, the work, and the quiet, overwhelming responsibility of raising their son alone. He saw the same untamable wildness in Diablo that he felt in his own grief, a destructive force that defied logic and resisted comfort. That was why his blood ran cold when Eli first said the name. Eli, his quiet, gentle boy, who spent his days observing the world from a vantage point of enforced stillness, had become fixated on the one creature David feared most. It had started with a drawing. Eli, whose hands were nimble and sure even if his legs were not, had sketched the bull with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of paper. It wasn't a monster he drew. It was majestic. He had captured the powerful curve of the bull's neck, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the sheer presence of him. David had found it on the small table beside Eli's bed, and a knot of dread had tightened in his stomach. "Where did you see him, buddy?" David had asked, his voice carefully casual. Eli had just pointed out the window, toward the distant pasture, a black speck moving against the golden grass. From that day on, it was a quiet obsession. Every morning, Eli would wheel himself to the living room window, his binoculars, a gift for his 6th birthday, held to his eyes. He would watch for hours. He didn't seem to see the rage. He saw something else. Something David, in his fear, couldn't comprehend. David tried to distract him, bringing home a puppy one day, a gentle golden retriever, that immediately devoted itself to the boy. Eli loved the dog, resting his hand on its soft fur as it slept at the foot of his wheelchair, but his gaze always returned to the window, to the dark shape in the distance. The pressure from the ranch hands, led by the foreman Hank, was becoming unbearable. Hank was a man carved from the land itself, practical, tough, and unsentimental. To him, Diablo was a line item of pure loss. Vet bills, repair costs, and a constant, looming threat of a lawsuit or a dead employee. "He's gotta go, David," Hank had said just last week, his face grim. "We can't keep him. It's a matter of time before he hurts someone for real, or worse." David knew he was right. The decision had been made. The vet was scheduled to come at the end of the week. It wasn't a rescue or a relocation. For a bull that dangerous, there was only one final solution. And as the day drew closer, a strange, urgent stillness fell over his son, culminating in the words David had prayed he would never hear. "Daddy," Eli said, his voice soft but firm, "I need to see him up close." The world seemed to shrink around David. Every sound magnified: the ticking of the grandfather clock, the sigh of the wind outside, the frantic, terrified beat of his own heart. He looked at his son, at this small, fragile boy, who carried a universe of wisdom in his silent gaze, and every protective instinct in his body screamed one word: no. It was an insane request. It was a father's worst nightmare brought to life. Taking his son, his vulnerable, irreplaceable son, anywhere near a creature that seasoned professionals refused to approach on foot was not just irresponsible, it felt like a betrayal of his duty as a parent. He saw the scene in his mind's eye: the bull's explosive charge, the splintering of wood and metal, his own helplessness. The image was so vivid, so horrifying, that the refusal was already forming on his lips. He opened his mouth to say it, to shut down this impossible idea once and for all. But he hesitated. He looked into Eli's eyes, and he didn't see a child's reckless whim. He saw a profound, unshakable certainty. It was the same look his wife, Sarah, used to get: a serene conviction that seemed to draw its strength from a source hidden from the rest of the world. "Please, Daddy," Eli whispered, and the simple plea dismantled all of David's carefully constructed walls of fear. In that moment, David was confronted with a terrible choice: protect his son from the monster in the pasture, or protect him from the quiet despair that had been slowly closing in on him since his mother's death. Eli had been retreating, folding into himself, his light dimming with each passing month. This was the first time in a year he had asked for something with such passion, with such life in his voice. Was David's fear more important than his son's spirit? Was he protecting Eli, or was he just protecting himself from the possibility of more pain? The internal battle was titanic. The rational part of his brain, the part that Hank represented, screamed that it was a suicidal errand. But the father in him, the husband who still ached for his wife's fearless intuition, saw a flicker of her in their son. He felt a pull toward an irrational, terrifying act of faith. "Okay," David heard himself say, the word tasting like ash and hope in his mouth. "Okay, buddy. We'll go see him." The decision felt like stepping off a cliff. He spent the rest of the day in a state of hyper-vigilant anxiety, planning every detail with a meticulousness born of sheer terror. He would keep the wheelchair a safe 50 feet from the outermost fence. Hank and 2 other hands would be there, armed with rifles, not for Diablo, but for defense. A steel gate would be between them at all times. It was a fortress of precautions, but David knew, deep down, that against a creature of Diablo's power, it was all just an illusion of safety. The walk to the pen was the longest of David's life. The sun beat down with an indifferent intensity, baking the dry earth and casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to writhe like serpents on the ground. The air was thick, with a silence that felt heavier than sound. Usually, the ranch was a symphony of noise: the distant lowing of cattle, the shout of a cowboy, the rumble of a truck. Today, there was nothing. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. David's hands were slick with sweat on the handles of Eli's wheelchair. With every push, the rubber wheels crunched over gravel and dirt, a rhythmic grinding sound that marked their progress toward a potential catastrophe. Eli was perfectly still, his small hands resting in his lap, his gaze fixed forward. He wasn't scared. David could feel the calm radiating from him, a stark and unnerving contrast to the frantic chaos in his own chest. Hank and two other ranchers, Tom and Cal, walked a few paces ahead. Hank's face was a mask of grim disapproval. He carried his rifle with a grim familiarity, his eyes scanning the reinforced enclosure, as if expecting it to burst apart at any moment. He had argued with David one last time that morning. "It's a fool's errand, David. What are you trying to prove?" David hadn't had an answer. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just following a thread of hope so thin it was nearly invisible. They reached the outer perimeter, a sturdy wooden fence 50 feet from the steel corral where Diablo was kept. This was the designated safe zone. But as David stopped the wheelchair, Eli shook his head. "Closer," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I have to be closer." David's heart hammered against his ribs. "Eli, no. This is as far as we go." "He can't hear me from here," Eli insisted, turning to look at his father. The profound trust in his son's eyes was a physical blow. It was a trust David felt he was about to shatter, one way or another. Have you ever been so terrified that your body wants to flee, but a love for someone else holds you rooted to the spot? That was David's world in that moment. Every cell screamed run, but his son's hand, now reaching out to touch his, held him fast. Against every instinct, against Hank's furious, disbelieving glare, David unlatched the gate of the outer fence and pushed the wheelchair into the narrow corridor between the two enclosures. Now, only a wall of 6-inch steel bars separated his son from nearly a ton of furious muscle and bone. The moment the wheels of the chair rolled onto the dirt inside the corridor, Diablo exploded into motion. It was a hurricane of black hide and furious intent. He charged the steel bars not with a blind rage, but with a terrifying purpose. He slammed his massive head against the metal, and the entire structure groaned, the impact vibrating through the ground, up through the soles of David's boots and into his very bones. A collective gasp went through the men standing behind them. Hank raised his rifle, the click of the safety being disengaged, echoing in the sudden silence that followed the impact. Diablo backed away, his chest heaving, his nostrils flared wide. He stared at the small figure in the chair, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within him. He pawed the ground, sending clumps of dirt flying, his tail lashing like a whip. This was the moment of truth. David's hand hovered over his son's shoulder, ready to yank the chair back, to run, to do anything to undo this catastrophic mistake. His mind was a slideshow of regrets. He shouldn't have listened. He should have been the father, the authority. He had let a child's fantasy lead them to the brink of disaster. He could feel the heat radiating from the bull's body, could smell the scent of dust and raw, animal fury. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an unbearable, silent scream. He saw the muscles in Diablo's haunches bunching, coiling for another charge. He saw the pure, undiluted hatred in the animal's eyes. It was a hatred that seemed aimed not just at Eli, but at the entire world. The world that had caged him, prodded him, and misunderstood him. Hank's voice was a low, urgent command from behind. "David, get the boy out of there, now!" But Eli didn't flinch. He didn't cry out. He simply lifted one small hand, palm open, in a gesture of peace. He watched the furious beast, his own expression one of intense concentration, as if he were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. The bull lowered its head, horns aimed directly at the boy, and took one deliberate step forward. The space between them shrank. Another step. The air grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. David's muscles were locked in paralysis, caught between the instinct to flee and the inability to abandon his son. This was it, the point of no return. Then something shifted in the suffocating tension. It wasn't a loud noise that broke the spell. It was the opposite. It was a whisper. So soft it was almost stolen by the breeze, a fragile thread of sound woven into the fabric of terror. Eli began to sing. It wasn't a song of words, not at first. It was just a melody, a simple, haunting lullaby, a tune of just a few notes, repeated in a gentle, rhythmic pattern. The sound was so small, so out of place in the face of such monumental rage, that it should have been meaningless. It should have been swallowed whole by the bull's fury. But it wasn't. As the first few notes reached him, Diablo froze. His entire body went rigid. The pawing stopped. The lashing tail fell still. The deep rumbling growl in his chest died in his throat. A tremor ran through his powerful shoulders, but it was not a tremor of rage. It was a tremor of confusion. He lifted his head, the murderous intent in his eyes faltering, replaced by a flicker of bewilderment. He cocked one ear, then the other, tilting his massive head as if trying to pinpoint a sound from a long-forgotten dream. Eli didn't stop. He continued to hum, his voice gaining a quiet confidence. The melody floated across the space between them, a bridge of sound built over an ocean of fear. David watched, his own terror, momentarily forgotten, replaced by a disbelieving awe. He knew that tune. It was buried deep in his own memory, layered under years of grief. It was the song Sarah used to hum. She would hum it while she worked in her garden, while she painted, while she rocked Eli to sleep as a baby. It was her sound, the gentle music of her soul. How could Eli remember it with such clarity? He had been so young. As the realization dawned on David, he saw the transformation happening in the bull. The rage wasn't just pausing, it was receding. Like a monstrous tide pulling away from the shore, the fury was draining from Diablo's posture, from his eyes, from his very being. The bunched muscles relaxed. The defensive, aggressive stance softened. He stood there, motionless, utterly captivated by the small boy and his impossible song. The hardened ranchers behind them were silent, their rifles lowered, their faces a mixture of shock and wonder. They were witnessing a language they didn't know existed, a communication that defied every rule of their world. The lullaby was a key, and it was turning a lock deep inside the bull's consciousness. For 2 years, Diablo's world had been a maelstrom of fear, aggression, and confusion. His rage was a fortress built around a core of loss he couldn't comprehend. But this sound, this melody, it was older than the fortress. It predated the anger. As Eli's soft humming continued, a cascade of dormant senses awoke in the great beast. It wasn't a human memory of images and narratives, but a more profound animalistic recollection. A memory of feeling, the scent of sweet clover and a woman's soft perfume, a scent that had long been absent from the harsh smells of dust and fear. The memory of a gentle hand, smaller than a man's, scratching a spot behind his ears that no one had touched since. The feeling of warm sun on his back, in a small, peaceful paddock, not a prison of steel. And everywhere, woven through these sensations, was the song. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of his first home. Sarah had found him as a day-old calf, abandoned by his mother in near death. She had brought him into the warmth of the barn, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him from a bottle. She had named him Orion, after the stars. She spent every day with him, and as she cared for him, she hummed that simple, nameless tune. It was the soundtrack of his infancy, the first and most powerful association he had with comfort and love. When she had suddenly disappeared from his life, the music had stopped, the safety had vanished. The world had become a loud, threatening, and painful place. He grew bigger, stronger, and the gentle calf named Orion was buried under the weight of fear and grief, eventually re-emerging as the monster they called Diablo. The name, the RAGED, was all a defense against a world that no longer sang to him. Now, hearing the melody again, from this small, fragile being, was like a seismic shock to his soul. The song was the same, but the voice was different, a child's whisper instead of a woman's hum. Yet, the essence was identical. It was the echo of a lost paradise. David watched, tears now blurring his vision as he finally understood. It wasn't just a random tune Eli was humming. It was his mother's song, passed from her heart into his, a legacy of love he hadn't even known he carried. The dramatic irony was crushing and beautiful. Everyone had seen a monster, but Sarah had raised a friend, and Eli, her son, was the only person on earth who could remind him. The final wall of Diablo's rage crumbled. It did not just fall, it dissolved into nothingness. With a low, soft sound, not a growl of anger, but a deep sigh of surrender, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then, another. He moved not with the coiled power of an attacker, but with the cautious reverence of a pilgrim approaching a sacred place. He walked to the steel bars that separated him from the boy, the very bars he had tried to destroy just minutes earlier. He stopped, his massive head just inches from Eli's small body. The air was electric, but the current had changed from terror to a breathtaking tenderness. For a long, heart-stopping moment, he simply looked at the boy, his dark, liquid eyes holding a depth of emotion that no one would have ever believed possible. He saw not a threat, but a memory. He heard not a challenge, but a homecoming. Then, slowly, with an elegance that seemed impossible for a creature of his size, he lowered his head. He tilted it to the side, turning his horns away in a universal gesture of non-aggression. And then, he did the impossible. He extended his head through the bars, his damp nose touching the back of Eli's small, outstretched hand. He didn't push, he didn't nudge. He just rested his head there, a gentle, immense weight of trust and recognition. He closed his eyes and let out another long, slow breath. It was a sound of profound release, the exhalation of 2 years of pain and fear. A single tear tracked its way through the dust on David's cheek. He looked over at Hank. The foreman's rifle was now resting forgotten at his side. His weathered face, usually set in a stern, impenetrable mask, had crumpled. His jaw was slack with disbelief, and his eyes were wide and wet. He looked from the bull to the boy and back again, shaking his head slowly, as if trying to wake himself from a dream. The other 2 men were equally stunned into silence, their tough exteriors stripped away, revealing the raw, astonished humanity beneath. In that moment, in the quiet space between a boy and a bull, an entire belief system was being dismantled. The world was not as simple as they had thought. Monsters were not always what they seemed. And strength, they were learning, came in forms they had never imagined. Eli started to whisper words now, intertwined with the melody. "It's okay," he said, his voice clear and calm. "She's gone, but I'm here. It's okay." The news of what happened at the pen spread across the ranch, and then the county, like a wildfire of wonder. It became a local legend overnight, the story of the boy in the wheelchair who had tamed the untamable beast. People started to drive by, hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle. But for those who had been there, and for those on the ranch, it was something far deeper than a spectacle. It was a fundamental shift in the very soul of their community. The vet's appointment was canceled without a second thought. The name Diablo was quietly retired, spoken only when recounting the before part of the story. Now, when the men spoke of him, they called him Orion, the name Sarah had given him, a name resurrected from memory by her son. David felt as though he was seeing his own son for the first time. For years, he had looked at Eli and seen fragility. He had defined him by the chair he sat in, by the things he couldn't do, couldn't run, couldn't climb, couldn't play ball. His love was fierce, but it was colored by pity and fear. Now, he saw none of that. He saw a strength that dwarfed his own, a courage that had faced down death armed with nothing but a memory and a song. He saw his wife's legacy not in a photograph or a piece of land, but living and breathing in the spirit of their child. Eli had not just saved a bull, he had healed his father. He had reminded David that the most profound limitations are not physical, but the ones we place on our own hearts and on the hearts of those we love. The transformation in Hank was almost as profound. The practical, no-nonsense foreman was humbled. He would often just stand by the fence, watching as Eli made his daily visit. The boy would wheel himself right up to the gate, which was now always left open for him, and Orion would amble over, resting his head on Eli's lap, as the boy read him stories from a picture book. Hank saw in that image a truth more powerful than profit margins or safety protocols. He saw that mercy was not a weakness, but a kind of power the world desperately needed. He became Eli's quiet guardian, ensuring no curious stranger got too close, preserving the sanctity of their bond. The deeper truth settled over all of them. Orion's rage had never been malice. It was a howl of grief, a desperate cry for a connection that had been violently severed. He was a mirror, reflecting the unspoken pain that both David and Eli carried. By soothing the bull's grief, Eli had found a way to voice his own, to process a loss that had been too big for words. A new routine settled over the ranch, a rhythm of peace that had been absent for years. The fence around Orion's pasture was no longer seen as a cage to contain a monster, but as the boundary of a sanctuary. It was a symbol of a profound truth. Sometimes the barriers we build to keep danger out are the very things that keep love from getting in. Every afternoon, after his studies, Eli would make his way to the pasture. Sometimes his father would walk with him, no longer with a heart full of fear, but with a quiet sense of pride that was so immense it felt like it might burst. Other times, he would go alone, his motorized chair humming softly over the worn path that was now permanently carved into the earth. Orion would see him coming from 100 yards away and begin his slow, happy walk to meet him. Their time together was a portrait of gentle companionship. Eli would talk to him, telling him about his day, about the books he was reading, about the dreams he had at night. He would sing his mother's lullaby, not as a tool to calm a beast, but as a shared hymn of remembrance. And Orion, the great bull, would stand with a placid patience, his ear cocked toward the boy's voice, his presence a fortress of quiet strength around the child. He became Eli's protector. If a coyote strayed too close to the fence, a low rumble from Orion was enough to send it fleeing. He was a gentle giant, his power no longer a weapon of rage, but a shield for the small boy who had saved him. The story transformed Eli's life in the most beautiful way. He was no longer the boy in the wheelchair, an object of pity or awkward glances. He was Eli, the boy who spoke to animals, the boy with a special gift. The other children in the small town looked at him with awe and admiration. They would ask him questions, not about his chair, but about his friend, Orion. For the first time, Eli was defined not by his limits, but by his incredible, unique connection to the world. The boy who could not walk had taught everyone around him how to stand a little taller. The story became a modern parable for the whole community, a reminder that the most wounded souls often hide the greatest capacity for love, and that the softest voice can sometimes be the most powerful one in the room. It was a testament to a love so strong it could echo through time, be carried in a song, and bridge the chasm between a grieving beast and a lonely boy, forging a bond that healed them all. The sun would set over the golden hills, casting long shadows, and in the fading light, one could always see the silhouette of a boy and his bull, a perfect picture of a peace that had been fought for and won by the power of a gentle memory.